I first heard Dr. Damon Centola on the Hidden Brain podcast, which is an NPR, National Public Radio podcast that we have here. And I knew that he needed to come speak at the GoEd Exchange. Being GoEd's consumer and health practitioner communications person, whose job it is to convince consumers and health practitioners to take omega-3s seriously and increase their intake, I found his insights on how to change behavior to be, revelatory, if that's a word. Anyway. Dr. Damon Centola is a professor of communication, sociology, and engineering at the University of Pennsylvania, and he's the author of the book, Change, How to Make Big Things Happen. His research into how ideas spread and can affect lasting change is groundbreaking, and his presentation promises, big promises here today, to provide new insights on how to alter your pre-existing beliefs and drive change in consumer behavior. And it's nice that we just had a conversation about social media, because there's a lot that has to do with your social networks that I think he'll be talking about today. So anyway, I now present virtually Dr. Damon Centola.
Thank you very much. I want to share with you today a few thoughts about behavior change, but not individual behavior change. I'm not interested in how one person or two people change their behavior. I'm interested in how 100,000 people change their behavior, how change spreads and grows into really a movement that can change the sort of cultures and norms within communities and within nations. And the first place to start with this is really to think about when change happens. Are people making those decisions to adopt a new product or an innovation or to join a new movement or to accept a new norm? Are they making them by themselves? Are they making them with people? And I think this is one of the sort of the really important ideas that sort of comes to the fore here when we look at this kind of process. Let's say these fish schooling, and you look at these fish individually. You can take fMRI scans of them. You can sort of analyze them biologically in every other way. And the question is, if you were to do that for every one of these 50,000 fish, could you ever predict, understand, or explain these collective patterns they produce? Or could you figure out ways of amplifying those patterns or disrupting them? And the answer, of course, is no. If you want to understand this collective pattern within this fish community, you need to understand how they school together. And that's really what the sort of new science of networks is all about. It's about this question of, once you have people interacting together, how do those dynamics produce behaviors and really changes in the collective pattern of action that you could never anticipate just by looking at people one at a time? So when we look at these sort of large-scale patterns of connectivity, and we can do this, of course, online with almost all the social media technologies and the data that come from them, but we can also do this offline now, looking at people's neighborhood patterns of interaction, how they spread from community to community. So it's a very sort of important age in terms of the availability of data to evaluate some very long-standing and important intuitions we've had for nearly a century about how social influence operates and how it leads to sort of large-scale acceptance of innovations. So the two sort of key ideas that come out of this literature, again, that's really been around since the 1940s, is that there are some people in the network who are really highly connected. And we tend to refer them today as influencers, but the term of art a couple decades ago was opinion leaders. It basically means the same thing. It's this person shown on the left who's, got lots of ties, going out in all directions. And we contrast that with the person shown on the right. These people shown on the right are connected together. Each, of course, has more modest contacts than the person in the center. But in addition to that, it's not just the number of contacts people have, it's the connectedness, right? So the person in the center has ties shooting out in all directions. We call these often weak ties. Whereas the people in the periphery, their lower number of ties are connected to each other, creating these little triangles or clusters. Both of these things are important, not just the number, but also the pattern of connectedness. And the classic sort of theory of diffusion that most of us still have today with the marketing budgets that we put into influencers really comes from a very old intuition that if we're looking at social change or innovation diffusion or the adoption of a new idea, the way that process unfolds is that you have some really highly connected person who adopts it. They spread that to all of their peers. And then their peers in turn spread it to their peers and so on and so forth. And this generates what is essentially a cascade process that goes from the center to the periphery or the margins of the network. And like I said, this intuition has been with us for a long time. And this is what sits behind a lot of the marketing budgets that we use for social media. The thing is that in the last decade, we've been able to collect really good data on how social change spreads and how new ideas spread. One of the examples I like to use is this example of the growth of Arab Spring in Egypt, because it's such a compelling and important social movement, but we also have exact data on like how it took hold and how it spread. And what's so interesting about it is that although you had opinion leaders and sort of highly connected activists advertising and marketing really this movement idea for months before it actually happened, it didn't take hold because of any of those messages. It actually took hold because a group of people on the periphery of the network started mobilizing. And when it started to spread, it didn't just jump to the center. It actually started to cascade around the edges of the network and then only reach the center at the end. And so this motivates really a fundamental puzzle in our theory of marketing, in our theory of behavior change, and our theory of social change more generally, which is that the diagram on the left shows diffusion and change spreading from the inside out, whereas the data on the right shows that change actually grows around the periphery and spreads to the center. And this really nails, I think, a fundamental intuition about social networks, which sits behind almost all of our thinking. And the intuition is, if I were to try to spread an innovation, if I were trying to do everything I could to make it take hold. And you can think now of social movements like Black Lives Matter, or of course, innovation and marketing campaigns for product diffusion. Who should I target? Where should I put my efforts if I want to take a social network approach? And the vast majority of us would say the network on the left. Obviously, you pick that highly connected person, you incentivize them, and they'll spread this idea to everybody. And the point of all this new science is that intuition actually is painfully wrong, and not only has failed in the past, but has led to like backfire effects where products actually lose status, reputation, and companies actually wind up losing status and reputation. The network on the right actually winds up being the kind of place in the social network that is most effective for introducing change campaigns. And again, this is true for social movements, it's true for innovative products, and it's true for new ideas and political movements. And what goes on here, and this is, I think, one of the key things that the good science does, is it doesn't just say people were saying the wrong answer, here's the right answer. It explains why we got it wrong. Right? What was the mistake we were making? And the mistake we've been making is we've been using epidemiology, which is basically the spread of viruses. We've been using epidemiology as our reference point for understanding all human behavior, right? And from an epidemiological point of view, which we're all pretty familiar with now from COVID-19, basically exposure leads to spreading. So this is what we do with contact tracing. We try to find if someone was sick, who they interacted with, if that person got sick, who they interacted with, and it's basically this chain. And the assumption is if there's someone who's really highly connected, that they're going to be a source of spreading for a lot of other people. And this is why we try to limit travel and limit contact and so forth, is to kind of cut out those hubs from the network. But the problem is that model of spreading doesn't at all explain how humans change their minds or how humans adopt new behaviors. In fact, when we're thinking about a behavior, we're paying a lot of attention to the social context and the peer feedback and the ways in which the network around us kind of provides supporting influences and countervailing influences, all of which balance each other out when we're deciding to adopt a new behavior. Safety becomes an issue, concerns of legitimacy become an issue. All of these things never enter into epidemiology. And what happens is once we start to consider these, all of our epidemiological intuitions fail. And so the punchline here is I'm going to talk about virality and how it works and why it fails. And the key theoretical distinction, the key idea that's going to motivate all of our thinking and really all of the applications and strategies that come out of this is a distinction between, on the one hand, a simple contagion, which is basically like a virus, and on the other hand, a complex contagion, which really is behavior change or product adoption. I'm going to talk about some of the myths of diffusion. And then once we get to sort of understand this, the way that I'm going to conclude is by talking about how we can use this idea to trigger tipping points for large-scale change. And one of the interesting implications that comes out of this is that we've been talking for 15 years now about nudges. And the idea of nudges really comes from behavioral economics, and it's this idea that we can sort of give people individual signals that will stimulate their behavior in one direction or another. This has been kind of cleverly successful for some things like opt-in versus opt-out, but it hasn't generalized very well to other things, which are like really challenging behavior change innovations and interventions. And the reason for that is that people aren't just looking at whatever stimuli you give them, whatever commercials you give them, or whatever website they're looking at. They're also paying attention to the people around them. It's more a question of norms than nudges, and that's sort of where this work really lands. So again, I'm going to give you an overview, simple and complex. And I'm going to talk about 3 myths that once we understand how behavior works, we can really debunk some of the basic assumptions from marketing and from innovation and product diffusion strategies. The first is the myth of virality. The second is the myth of stickiness. And the third is the myth of the influencer. These are 3 biggies. We've heard about these for 2 decades now, and all 3 of them are importantly wrong. Then I'm going to talk about what this means for how you can think about this strategically in terms of building a contagion infrastructure to help support the growth of behavior change and norm change. And then most strategically, we can think about how to target populations in terms of introducing innovations into a network to trigger tipping points. So let's start by talking about contagiousness. So a good way of talking about this is, what is the difference between an innovative product or a viral video, right? So when a viral video comes into a population, or a new piece of gossip, or even the sort of COVID-19 virus, a person sort of shows up and has contact with somebody else, and that leads to an infection. And then that person, then once they adopt it, or they sort of start to spread this gossip, or they start to spread this virus, then they infect everybody else. The thing is, if you were to look at this picture, you would say, well, that's how we think networks operate. That's our classic model of network spreading. But the problem is that there are some huge assumptions that don't generalize to human behavior. One is that every single contact leads to transmission. So you and I all know that if someone introduces a new product to you, you don't just go out and buy it. You think about it and you ask other people about it. This means that essentially you have some resistance, but this model assumes that there's no resistance. Contact equals transmission. In the same way that if you come into contact with COVID-19, you don't have to debate whether or not to get it. You just get it. So the things that are spreading as simple contagions are easy, familiar, low-cost things. Complex contagions are different. So now imagine this person comes into a network, and instead of spreading COVID-19, this person is wearing a face mask. And the person in the center is also surrounded by lots of people who are not wearing face masks. So all of those people are implicitly countervailing influences. They don't have to do anything. All they have to do is not exhibit the behavior, and the person in the center is paying attention to them. This is also true for any other kind of health innovation. Anything that people can see, or people sort of maybe take seriously as something that may be a violation of a social norm. People are looking at the non-adopters. Of course, that doesn't happen with disease. It doesn't matter how many healthy people you know. All that matters is you come in contact with a sick person. It's also true for gossip. It doesn't matter how many people you know who don't know the piece of gossip. In fact, it's better if they don't, because then you get to spread it. But for something that's complex, any kind of new technology or new health innovation, you're waiting for people to sort of confirm that this thing is a good thing, to create some credibility and legitimacy for it. So a second person may adopt. And finally, if a third person adopts, you may feel like this has enough social backing, there's less risk. And then finally you adopt. And so part of what's going on here is that people require multiple sources of influence before they adopt. But really what's underneath that is that there's some resistance to the behavior. There's some reason why people are worried or concerned, or there's some sort of sense of risk that people are waiting to have eliminated by social proof. And what happens in those cases, whenever a product is difficult or unfamiliar or costly, is that the dynamics now change to that of a complex contagion. And once we know the difference between a disease or a piece of gossip like simple contagion versus a behavior change like complex contagion, we realize that most of the logic that we've used for spreading behavior change, for marketing innovation and product diffusion, is based on simple contagions. And once we switch to complex contagion, we realize that the whole notion of virality, which is that successful innovation spread like a virus, is wrong. The notion of stickiness, which is that if you just build a better product, then people will use it, that's well known to be wrong. In fact, it's one of the famous results in economics. And the fact that you can just get a highly connected person like an influencer to spread your idea also doesn't work. So let's start talking about the myth of virality, since I think that's sort of the place to start in thinking about where our intuitions are now operating and where we need to sort of change our thinking. So one of my favorite examples of this, I'm going to focus a lot today. The book has lots of examples across lots of different sectors, but I'm going to focus primarily on health examples or health behavior change examples, because I think that's most relevant to the kind of omega-3 market. So in Korea in the 1960s, there was this big challenge of spreading contraception. So a lot of nations at this time were going through demographic transition. They were getting, increased sanitation, increased, medical technology, increased food production. And the problem was, and it seems like those are all good things, but the problem was families were still having, they were living in agrarian societies where there was high infant mortality. So families were having like 5 to 6 children. And if you reproduce at that rate, and you also have all of these new safety nets for health, like medication, sanitation, vaccination, industrialization, then you wind up having very low infant mortality. And what winds up happening is just within 2 generations, you're going to have massive, very dangerous overpopulation, which can just collapse the national economy and also lead to, massive death tolls. So the goal was to increase contraception rates, but of course this contradicted all the social norms where people were supposed to have lots of kids because that would help maintain national fertility rates, of course, because infant mortality was so high. And so lots of countries tried mass media campaigns and even shaming techniques. You shouldn't have children, but the culture in these countries was largely immune to that because people were looking to their peers and neighbors to see their social expectations. The one example that stands out as the most successful contraception campaign probably in history was in Korea, where they basically shifted the entire country's norms within less than 20 years, which if you think about any campaign that the U.S. has had in the last, half century, that's a remarkable achievement to, think about the war on drugs, which started almost 50 years ago. And then, about 5 years ago, Congress admitted that not only was it a failure, but things had actually gotten worse. Right. So it's very hard to shift national norms and national policies in such a short time scale. So what happened in Korea? Why did they succeed? And what really happened was that they triggered a normative change where it's not just that people started using contraception, it's that the entire country shifted to sort of a conception of themselves as people who use contraception and that being sort of good citizenship. So the most interesting thing about this process is that you can see in the village networks where the sort of intervention was attempted, the villages that succeeded very effectively and the villages that failed. So here on the left-hand side, we have villages that are kind of clumped together in this high clustered way, and they have some sort of ties or bridges to other villages, but they're sort of what we think of as weak ties, or just one link across villages. Here on the far right, you have an urban network in which kind of people bounce into people, but there's no sort of social clustering in villages. And then here in the middle, we have this kind of wide bridge case. And this winds up being the most interesting, both scientifically and from a policy point of view, because you have these sort of clusters of groups, but you also have wide bridges, which are reinforcing ties across the groups. And that's really interesting because it creates kind of a social integration that's very, very effective for diffusing innovation. So here I'm going to show you a model. And this is based on the data from Korea, where what you can see is the nodes shown in red are the innovators trying to sort of get contraception off the ground. And what happens here in this group is that the innovation sort of takes hold and sort of spreads within this one cluster, but it can't spread across clusters. And what happens in the urban group is that you basically get no traction whatsoever because the innovation can't actually get any social support because everyone's sort of talking to everyone and you need some sort of social reinforcement. What happens most compellingly in this group with wide bridges is that you get reinforcement within this cluster, but then it kind of cascades over to the other clusters and spreads in this really organic fashion throughout the social network. And what's so interesting is that this maps exactly onto how organizational networks take form. One of the classic problems in organizations is that you've got different groups, let's say design, engineering, and manufacturing. And the three groups probably, oftentimes are siloed. They don't have a lot of communication across them. And one of the big innovations in network theory in the 90s was to say, well, you should have a broker. You should have a person whose job it is, Robert in this case, to make a tie over to group A to Elizabeth and to group C to Emily, and to start sort of sharing innovations across these groups. That's a really core intuition. And one of the ideas is that Robert gains a lot of power within the organization because now he's a broker. He's the person people go to. He gains more ties because more people know about him. He gets promotions and advancements because he's sort of in the mix whenever new things are happening. And that's true from a networking point of view. And if you were to sort of think about how I can use my networks to my own advantage, Robert gets a lot of advantage. But here's the downside. From the point of view of complex contagion, Robert can spread information from group B over to group A or to group C. But Robert has a really hard time mobilizing any kind of initiative or change campaign or organizational adaptation because the only connection he has is to Elizabeth. And if Elizabeth tries to communicate that, hey, Robert's advocating this new idea, everybody knows that Robert is a broker. Everybody knows that Robert's credit and status comes from brokering ideas. And it's not they don't trust him personally, but it's that everyone can see structurally that it's to his advantage to have stuff spread. And whereas for information, that's not a problem, when it comes to people changing their work routines or changing their norms or changing their patterns of behavior, all of a sudden that is a problem because people don't necessarily trust that Robert and his group B are doing the same kinds of things over in design that we're doing over here in engineering. And so what happens here is something very interesting. If you start connecting the groups within an organization with wider bridges, and some of the work that we've done on organizational change, all of a sudden you see that people in group A can talk to each other about what people in group B are doing, and they can independently observe the changes that people in group B are adopting in terms of their workplace practices. And then that coordination becomes the vehicle for then shifting an innovation that is popular in B to then become popular in A. This is important for everything from gender in the workplace, norms of sexual harassment, changes in beliefs about what's the acceptable way to handle, innovative product design. And thirdly, and most importantly, the ways that organizations can adapt to all the changing things that are happening in this sort of organizational ecology around them. Organizations with weak ties or with narrow bridges tend to become kind of static. Organizations with these wide bridges tend to be very flexible and adaptive in their ability to sort of incorporate innovations that, let's say, one group sort of takes on early and then can spread to other groups and make the whole organization much more flexible. So what this means is we can talk about organizations, but also about consumer communities as having structures that are really supportive of the adoption of innovation and really the effective ability to spread an innovation from one part of a community to the other. It turns out that when we look at almost all of the successful industries, right, not just within a particular organization, but across organizations, we see this pattern of connectedness through wide bridges that allows complex ideas, complex knowledge to effectively grow across organizational boundaries. These companies and these initiatives, and this includes the Black Lives Matter initiative, adopted a strategy that was a networking strategy that was very unpopular before. I mean, organizations, initiatives, social movements tended to have a very kind of within the group, outside the group model, where if you're in the group, everyone sort of believes the same thing, or with you're in the organization, everyone kind of follows the organizational rules. And certainly from like an IP perspective, you don't share your strategies across organizational boundaries. But what Silicon Valley discovered was that if you started letting people from other organizations inside and work as teams that sort of spanned organizational boundaries, it just produced a wealth of innovation. All of a sudden, there were new ways of bringing products to market, new ways of innovating technologically, new ways of just thinking about market change and hoping, and in some cases succeeding, in trying to initiate change in how people sort of see products and accept new products. And so this sort of highlights a sort of a general change in thinking from going from the power of an individual broker to the power of these kind of groups that span different organizations or different constituencies to create kind of a collective network of wide bridges. And so this, when we think about the myth of virality, then highlights a new kind of intuition, which is how would you then introduce your innovation into a population most effectively? Let's say your population actually has the right structure. It has lots of clusters with overlapping wide bridges, and you say, this is perfect. This is sort of a consumer population or an industry population that we can effectively introduce our product or our ideas into. How should we go about doing that? What's our this is the term we use as seeding strategy. How do we seed it into that population? Well, the strategy on the left is the viral strategy, which is to say we want to get as much exposure as possible for our idea. And that is that's a very intuitive approach. It's the approach that most of us adopt, which is to say, if I have a small number of seeds and I have a finite budget and I can only invest in, getting a certain number of change agents within this population, I should distribute those change agents as widely as possible. I should have, those red dots representing our change agents. I should have them talking only to new customers or new people. So I get, these sort of multiple points of initiation. This would be a very effective way of spreading the measles, and also, as we all know, of COVID-19. But it's not an effective way to initiate behavior change. And the reason is because each of those change agents is surrounded by people who don't know about this idea, who are probably doing something else already, so they sort of resist the idea. And the change agents themselves have no support to help convince people and no support for themselves to even help maintain the idea. The complex seeding strategy is on the right, and it's counterintuitive because you basically cluster all your change agents together in the same sort of group. Now, you essentially have your change agents talking to each other. And that, from a classic marketing perspective, makes no sense, because it's basically saying, if I have, a bunch of telemarketers, why would I have my telemarketers call each other? What's the point? They all know about this product. But you have to imagine that change agents are within a community, and they're surrounded by peers, and they're looking at those peers. And so the only way they're going to be sort of effective at shifting peers' understanding, belief, their sense of credibility, and most importantly, legitimacy for this behavior change, and particularly in health, is by having other change agents they can coordinate with to help convince people that this is a really new and important idea. Also, your change agents now are protected from all the countervailing influences, because they cannot talk to the other change agents and feel like, yeah, what we're doing is important, it's going to last, even though it may not take hold immediately, we can stick with it and start to grow a change campaign. And it turns out that this sort of model is exactly what worked in Korea. Is they basically started with these women's groups, and small women's groups took hold of the idea, and then it grew within a cluster, and the women's groups had this overlapping structure of wide bridges, and it grew from group to group to group. Now, one of the most interesting points that comes out of this is going to talk to the sort of the idea of stickiness, is that when we think about this happening, we can say, okay, I can see why the structure of a community would matter. And I can see that we might want to think about sort of the network pattern within a community and the value of wide bridges. And I can also see why we might want to seed differently than we might think, because we want to grow a supporting cluster for an innovation. But at the end of the day, wouldn't the innovation that spreads be like the stickiest, best innovation in any case? And the answer is that not necessarily. What happened in Korea was that villages as a whole all converged on the same method. So some villages became IUD villages. Everyone used the IUD. Other villages became condom villages. Other villages were pill villages. And so what's interesting is, although you had convergence within a community on a method of contraception, each community adopted a different method. And so it's not as if there was like one ideal best product or one ideal best method. It's more that people, whatever method took hold, people converged on that as a norm within the community. And that becomes sort of the most important take-home lesson for the myth of stickiness, which is, instead of focusing on the product itself as the key determinant of whether or not people adopt, the most important thing to think about is, how do the networks around people reinforce the acceptability of that product? So we've been told for a couple of years now that, the things to think about when you're trying to make something contagious are, make the product emotional, give it social triggers, make it public, make it practical, so forth. The thing is that when we look at product diffusion, success, and failure, we often see that products were marketed excellently, that had all the properties that a successful product should have, often fail. And we often see like the less efficient, less cost effective, and poorer products succeed. And this has become like one of the great legacies in the sort of economic theory, is how to explain this, because it contradicts everything we think about how markets work. And what's going on in these cases, and I'll talk about the case specifically with health, because I think that this phenomenon happens way more often than people are comfortable with in the health space, is that the networks around people and the structure of those networks is basically determining which behaviors get selected. So one of the great examples of this is this phenomenon of essentially this huge push in the early 90s to make pre-exposure prophylaxis, in the early 2000s, pre-exposure prophylaxis available in sub-Saharan Africa. This is basically a pill. And the problem was that every strategy for HIV prevention was basically this really intensive, and in some cases like cultural profanity, this very kind of hard behavior like male circumcision or getting people to use condoms. And those are behaviors that people resist for lots of reasons, but not least of which, it seems like, you have white Westerners coming in and telling, people living in Africa they should do different things with their sex behavior. And that's a very hard thing to do culturally, in addition to which male circumcision was seen as this really offensive behavior, and in some cases wound up in like violent backlash against the WHO. So they needed something that was stickier. They needed something that was simpler. They needed something that was going to be like the best product possible. So it turns out the medication that is used to treat HIV can also be used as a preventive. And they made it hugely available. It was free. It was accessible. It was convenient to get. It was basically one daily Tylenol, and it was 90% effective in preventing the transmission of HIV. So from the point of view of, HIV prevention, this is a miracle drug. Like, they solved the problem, they cracked the nut, and now they could just give people the free available drug that would stop the spread of HIV. And so they did these massive studies across 3 nations in sub-Saharan Africa. And they had people come every week and they would test their blood and give them the samples, and people would take the samples and go home. And what wound up happening is that after the several months, they measured, the overall adoption and spread of, so the overall spread of HIV, but they were also measuring like the rate of use of this drug. And turns out that fewer than 30% of the people in the study who were actually coming, they were doing the hard work of showing up every week and having their blood drawn, but they weren't doing the easy work of taking the daily Tylenol, right? And so it confounds explanation. It's like, well, we made a simple, easy product and you have it in your hand, like take it. And this is the kind of frustration I think people feel in innovative spaces all the time. It's like the challenge isn't designing the innovation. The challenge is getting people to use it, right? And so what they found out was that what was essentially going on was that there were lots of fears in the community that taking this HIV preventive medication would in some cases cause HIV. Now, it sounds at first blush like, why would anyone think that? That seems crazy. A large fraction of people in the US think that taking a flu vaccine will give them the flu, or taking the COVID-19 vaccine will give them COVID-19, right? Like, it's a widespread concern. It's a kind of misinformation, but it's also a general kind of worry that people have about any kind of new health product. And it particularly shows up with preventive medications. But also, and importantly, there were tremendous discriminatory norms against people who had HIV. So that added to the concern. If there was any even small risk that taking this pill would somehow lead to HIV, or would somehow lead to your neighbors thinking that you were at greater risk of HIV, which is ironic, right? Because taking the pill makes you at less risk of HIV. But if you perceive that your neighbors might think it created greater risk of HIV, then you also wouldn't take it because you wouldn't want them to know. You wouldn't want them to see the packaging. You wouldn't want them to know it was in your house, right? You just wouldn't want to be associated with it at all. And so the point here is that the social norms in a community do far more work for governing people's ability to accept and adopt new products than the product itself. And so the strategy that people often adopt is to say, well, that's fine. Okay, what we should do is get a highly influential opinion leader. This is how we change norms. I believe you about the norm story. I've seen the stickiness thing fail before with my own products. So I believe that we should just get like the best, most influential person to, convince everyone to adopt this behavior. Now we're back to this, right? We're back to this model of, here's a social network, here's a person who's highly connected, here's the periphery. Why don't we just target the highly connected people? So the highly connected people have some advantages, certainly for simple contagions. First of all, because they're so highly connected, they discover things early on, then they adopt those innovations and, of course, can spread them to everyone else. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a good model for gossip. It's a really good model for disease spread. But when it comes to behavioral contagion, the thing you need to think about is that someone who's highly connected, those ties aren't just outgoing ties, right? Those ties are incoming ties. These people are highly watched and highly commented on. And so as a result, the highly connected people often are extremely conservative before adopting something that's controversial, something that's not quite accepted in the community. And so this is why you almost always see, when we look at the data, you almost always see that the highly connected people, when it comes to something innovative or difficult or just not widely known, the highly connected people tend to be the people who adopt last in a process, not the people who adopt first. And this has been true for every kind of institutional change and even changes in the medications and the changes in the prescriptions and the changes in the health advocacy that physicians will do. Physicians are very sensitive to the opinions of other physicians. And the most highly connected physicians tend to advocate really conservative, sort of run-of-the-mill stuff. And they tend to be fairly conservative when it comes to advocating health strategies or, supplements or things that can be potentially helpful, but that there's not enough support yet in their community for. And this is where you think of the networks of sort of peripheral, less connected, less prominent clinicians as being the better networks to target for growing support for those kinds of recommendations. Of course, in the last decade, we have much more data and much higher quality data. So it's true also for the adoption of every kind of technology we've seen. And this is interesting because you think of social media technologies as spreading in the ether, in the sort of virtual space. There should be no reason why it doesn't just spread everywhere at once. But they actually tend to spread through these like overlapping wide bridges in exactly the way that something like contraception spreads. Of course, movements across social media, you would also expect to just spread everywhere at once. But it's always the case. Every single large data set we have shows consistently the dynamics of complex contagion, where like wide bridges across social media are the most important factor for successful spreading. And these channels of communication, these channels of influence tend to bypass highly connected nodes until they get enough sort of critical mass and support that then highly connected nodes feel comfortable. There's less social risk with supporting this thing, particularly when they have a large audience. So this gives rise to this basic sort of the question I think everyone wants to know, which is, okay, what can we do? Where do we spend our marketing budget? How do we target networks effectively? So if you have a network that looks like this, something jumps out at you. You say, well, okay, it's very compelling and very intuitive to say, you've got that person there, and they're clearly the center of the network. So I want to use them as my sort of diffusion point. And you say, okay, well, look, if you can diffuse from that person, you can get this sort of explosive dynamic of cascading sort of viral growth. That works for viral videos. It works for gossip, it works for disease. But it's not just that it doesn't work for complex contagions, because what I've been saying so far is like, well, the strategy is really effective for simple contagion, not effective for complex contagion. It's actually worse than that. It's not just that it's not effective for complex contagion, it's that when you're dealing with complex contagions, this strategy can backfire enormously. And there's one of my favorite examples of this, I talk about this in the book, is exactly what Google Glass experienced. So Google Glass was, as most of us remember, it was like a highly sticky, highly engaging, memorable product. It had all the features that were supposed to make it successful, in addition to which their marketing strategy was to tell everyone about it, use a kind of viral campaign, and then target influencers, right? Get the elite people who could afford $1,500 glasses to wear glass, use glass, sort of be very conspicuous in their social presence and make everyone else want glass. But as most of us remember, what happened was that essentially the people who didn't have glass, right, instead of seeing the influencers as aspirational role models, they were supposed to want to be like them and go buy glass. The opposite happened. The behavior of browsing the web on your cybernetic eyewear while you were talking to someone was seen as really rude. More importantly, glass was perceived as like a surveillance technology for the rich, which offended a lot of people because you could videotape, record your visual landscape. And so there was enormous social pushback from the regular folks who we call like non-adopters against the influencers. And eventually it forced a kind of social divide where people who wore glass, instead of being thought of as like the people we should all follow, were referred to as glass holes. They were like excluded from restaurants and cafes. There were signs in windows saying, glass holes can't come in, glasswares can't come in, right? So this is exactly the opposite of the influencer strategy. It's that you've not only failed to make your product successful, you've actually alienated your influencers from the rest of the population you're supposed to be influencing. And the result was that the product line shut down, but more importantly, Google's company reputation took a hit. And I think that's the punchline, is that it's not just a matter of like not succeeding. It's really a fiasco if after trying to sort of make this major push into sort of wearable technologies, the company is actually seen as less respectable as a result of their strategy of trying to sort of generate a top-down sort of cascade process. So this is what happens when you try to use an influencer to spread, this, is that the people around this person push back. And what's interesting about this other strategy is that you can see that you can adopt basically a targeting strategy that picks people out here in sort of the periphery of the social network. And when you do that peripheral strategy, it's much more effective at generating reinforcement. Now, the cascade process doesn't look viral. It doesn't spread everywhere at once. The cascade process actually grows here around the periphery of the social network and then ultimately reaches a critical mass. And at that point, then it cascades through the center of the network. And so this gives us some like really important take-home lessons about how we make implementation decisions for the greatest possible impact. And there are sort of, I would say, three big points to focus on. One is reinforcement. If anything about your product or about your innovation or about your campaign involves legitimacy, you're going to need social reinforcement. You're going to need to worry about the non-adopters. You need to think about how the people who are adopting around the initial people create legitimacy and credibility for that idea. And wide bridges are sort of a mechanism for doing this, but also your seeding strategy of how to put your change agents together does this. Second of all is relevance. And this is something that comes up a lot in talking about different demographics and different populations, is who are people paying attention to, right? This is something we see a lot now with mask wearing, with vaccination. There's a lot of information coming at people. And in fact, so much information, they tend to sort of restrict their audience, restrict their view to looking at people who they feel like are trustworthy. And so the question is, well, what factors make people trustworthy so that wide bridges from them become the most relevant factors in determining their adoption? And that is essential for any sort of large scale behavior change or product innovation campaign, is you want to think about wide bridges across relevant communities and how you can span from one community to the next, to the next, to the next, so that by 3 steps or 4 steps, you're in a very different demographic range. Because what you've done is, instead of trying to hit everybody at once, you've grown a sort of a movement that spreads across communities and reaches through overlapping relevant groups. And that becomes a very important thing. And one of the most interesting punchlines here is almost everyone knows that we say, okay, people similar to us are the relevant, people to consider. But there are also cases, and this is one of the most interesting findings, I think, in the space of complex contagion, where there are also cases where the most compelling social reinforcement comes from diverse individuals, not from similar individuals. And this is because when you see people adopting from different social groups, that establishes a broad legitimacy for this idea and creates greater confidence in you that if I adopt it or if I express support for it, I won't just be representing the sort of one group I belong to. I'll actually be saying something that lots of different people support, and that reduces my social risk across lots of different audiences. And that's a very interesting, important way that networks, particularly social media networks, can operate to support sort of new normative change campaigns. And then finally, most importantly, what we're doing with change is not spreading information. There's lots of information you have. We all know there's good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. How has that changed your life exactly, right? And so the question is, well, so what does that mean in terms of my shifting understanding of what I do, of the behaviors I choose, and the influences around me? And this is where the focus really needs to be on norms and the acceptability of behaviors rather than just on information dissemination. So I'm going to conclude by talking briefly about tipping points, because I feel like when we get to all of these network punchlines, what we want to know is, what does this mean for large-scale change? How does this operate? So when we look at tipping points, I can talk, briefly about what this means for the growth of Black Lives Matter, but also the same ideas apply to the spread of acceptability of marriage equality, same-sex marriage, and also these same dynamics apply to the growth of the Twitter technology. And for each of these different kinds of social change cascades, you see the same process, right? We see there's a slow growth curve at the beginning, and then there's this sort of tipping point moment where everything accelerates. And then that's where we see huge takeoff. And I think in just about every industry out there, everyone's asking, where is that red dot? Like, how do we get there? What do we do? What's our strategy for hitting that? Now, in several studies I published, and I talk about this in the book as well, you can really identify that happening around 25% of the population. And the interesting question is why? What's the special thing that happens at 25%? Well, the story we've been told, and this is, again, been told since the 1960s, and it's something that I think are still taught in colleges, is that when you're looking at this growth curve, what you're actually looking at is, early adopters. And then when you get to the middle of the curve, you're looking at regular adopters. And the end of the curve are basically the laggards or the holdouts. This is a convenient description of this curve, but I want to emphasize there are no scientific studies that have ever shown this. This is basically an anthology put together by this guy, Everett Rogers, in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And he basically said, well, if you're going to describe this curve, you can call these people early adopters. But there's no data showing there's actually different types of people. So it's a convenient description, but it's scientifically useless because we don't know who the early adopters are, what that actually means in terms of initiating a cascade. What the network perspective does, it's so helpful, is give us actually a target for this sort of early process. We can say, look, what's going on here really is that this small growth curve, this short, shallow part of it, is really the structured periphery. This is the part where we want overlapping bridges to grow our sort of critical mass. And the reason why it grows more slowly here is because it's not spreading virally. It's spreading through sort of overlapping groups and sort of generating increased legitimacy and credibility. And this process can be a little bit slow. But once that process gets large enough, once you get sort of a big enough critical mass, then it accelerates through the center of the network. And this is where you get the influencers coming on board. And this is where you get rapid growth and things start to look viral. But the important part that people overlook is they sort of jump to this description of the center and they say, we want this virality. But what gets us there in the first place is this growth through the structured periphery to grow a critical mass. And then ultimately we reach sort of the end part. So what this looks like from a diffusion perspective is this is the part of the network I was talking about seeding before, this sort of part out in the periphery. And when you seed it, the contagion starts to spread and grow around these sort of structured, clustered communities. And you'll notice it doesn't just jump to the middle. It actually spreads through wide bridges until it reaches a critical mass. And then it accelerates across the middle of the network and then saturates the rest of the population. And so this is really the campaign strategy you want to adopt if you want to hit a tipping point. You need to think about how to grow a critical mass in the sort of wide bridges in the structured periphery of the network. This is true, and the book talks about this for the growth of acceptance of solar panels, for changes in bias, race and gender bias in clinical care, for reduced polarization online, for the growth of the Me Too movement, and of course for the growing acceptance of vaccination and strategies we can use for that. And so in conclusion, I want to sort of bring us back to our central intuition. There's a tendency, and I would say it's unavoidable. We all have it. When you look at these two networks, the network on the left just looks fast. It looks like like a red car. Like if you're going to strategize about trying to accelerate your diffusion campaign, you're always going to be pulled to that network on the left. And what I'm hoping is that by virtue of seeing this presentation and start to think about these ideas in the book, you can start to sort of conceptualize that, yes, that's true if we're talking about a simple contagion. But when we start to talk about complex contagions, it's really the network on the right that's going to do the work for us in terms of growing a critical mass. And of course, for every kind of social change, whenever something is unfamiliar or new or requires some degree of social reinforcement, this is going to be true. And again, this sort of changes our thinking from thinking about individual nudges to how to shift social norms at a population level. So with that, I'll stop and I look forward to taking your questions.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Centola. All right. At this point, yes, we can open it up to some questions. Do we have any questions here in the audience right now? Oh, we do have a question. Yep.
Yes, I was wondering if you could just restate again, what does a wide bridge look like in real life? It's a person, it's a relationship between people. When we're thinking and looking for wide bridges, what are we seeing?
Yeah, I have a chapter where I talk about this really in terms of the strategies you might adopt. So when you think about an entrepreneur within an organization, someone who wants to make their networking effective for both for organizational performance but also for themselves, what they tend to do is to say, I'm on the engineering team. Let me go meet someone, like actually establish like a relationship, a handshake, a conversation, who works over in the design team. And then my conversation and what it essentially turns into my friendship with that person winds up being a bridge. It's a communication channel across these two groups. But what if that person, instead of just stopping there and saying, okay, now I'm going to make a different bridge, I'm going to go meet someone in manufacturing and start a conversation with them, become friends with them, and start to create one of these sort of fireworks networks that sort of goes out in all directions. What if that person instead said, now I'm going to have a lunch, and I'm going to have a lunch where I'm going to invite like 3 of my colleagues from engineering to sit down with 3 of my new friends' colleagues from design. And we all meet and we start talking about sort of shared ideas and ways that new engineering products or new things that we're working on might be relevant to the design team or made the design team make it excited about and help us think about ourselves. And so now that turns into sort of a set of connections that are independent of that initial person between the 3 people from design and now the 3 people from engineering. Now imagine they say, well, let's hold a little workshop group and we'll invite people, and the 3 people from design, 3 people from engineering, we'll invite a couple more people. So now you get this kind of cluster of folks who are coming from both of these groups who start to interact and talk with each other. What do you think about the presentation? I thought those ideas were interesting. And so you get several sort of friendship connections across these groups. These informal ties are the essence of an organization. I think one of the greatest, most harmful things that social science ever did was come up with the organizational chart. Because most of what happens in organizations is through informal networks and through these kinds of communication channels. And so what a wide bridge is really is multiple reinforcing social connections across 2 groups that would have been otherwise distinct. I can talk more about that, but I want to know if that's helpful.
Any other questions? Or that was okay. I just wanted a clarification, Damon. I know you talked about the myth of the influencer. We do a lot of work working
Yeah.
with certain health influencers. But would you say that when you talk about trying to get to the periphery to then get to the center, you're still trying to have people with some influence. So is it like lower I influencers that then, start spreading the message to then get to the center and then you have the takeoff? I mean, you still need to somehow reach people that have influence. Is that right?
Well, the question is what does influence mean, right? The question is, if you throw your marketing budget at someone who's highly connected, let's say, at a very high level, let's say we're talking about, giving Kim Kardashian a ton of money to drink coconut water or a certain brand of coconut water. Well, drinking a certain brand of coconut water is a pretty simple contagion. There's nothing controversial or difficult about that. And so, from that point of view, that can make coconut water spread, right? Because a lot of people observe it, they think about it, they're like, oh, that's great. But if you try to get this kind of influencer to adopt something that's largely unpopular and not understood by people, then there's two downsides to that. One is that people are going to look at it and say, I don't quite get what she's doing, right? And the second is, like, if she keeps trying to push something that most people don't quite understand or like, she's going to quickly lose her status as an influencer, right? Influencers can't just say whatever they want. Right. And you can see this clearly with like the pandemic. Like why was it so ineffective to get, high status celebrities to get vaccinated? Why didn't that translate directly into high levels of vaccination? Because they tried to use the influencer strategy. And then there was like, op-ed after op-ed after op-ed for weeks in the New York Times saying like, it's completely ineffective. Why? And the reason is because vaccination, particularly in our day and age, is not a trivial behavior. It's not like when Elvis Presley got vaccinated for COVID. That was a different age. It wasn't as politicized, and certainly there wasn't as much sort of conspiracy rhetoric around it. But today, vaccination for COVID-19 is highly controversial. So just getting Dolly Parton to get vaccinated is not going to turn a lot of people who are Dolly Parton fans into people getting vaccinated. In fact, they'll start to worry about whether they should be following Dolly Parton, right? And so the point is that when you say influence, the question is, well, influence what? And if we're trying to sort of change norms in a consumer population, we need to think of it more as a social movement than as just as like make a simple product and have everyone adopt it. And I think that's really the one of the punchlines. This is what the influencer point ties into this notion of stickiness, because we tend to think we just create a simple product, right? But the simplicity of a product really depends on whether or not people are receptive to it. And if there's basically normative pushback from a population, then as fun and easy and useful as you make the product, there's still going to be resistance to it. And that's the question: is when there is resistance, how do you overcome it? And the point is, you actually look to a very different part of the social network. And this is something that we've done a lot of work to define mathematically. So we've been able to generate very clear, like specific predictions. Like in a network of 50,000 people, you can find the exact 5 people that you should target. And the point is, those people are not highly connected, but they're located in a space with a lot of bridges between other communities. They've got basically overlapping ties. They go from like one group to another group to another group. So we're talking about groups of like different income levels, groups of different races, groups of different sort of social and cultural backgrounds. And there's a cluster that's like the right cluster to kind of grow a lot of influence across these different groups. And it's not the highly connected person at the center. And that's, I think, the important punchline. Yeah, you can find influential people. They're just not the people we've been looking at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Are there any other questions for Damon? No? Okay. Well, thank you so much for closing out our Go It Exchange. I know we just have, well, first of all, I want to say thank you. Thank you so much to Dr. Centola.